Well, the state of Alabama carried out the execution of James Barber early this morning. He was convicted in 2003 of killing 75-year-old Dorothy Epps at her home in Harvest.
On the night Alabama prepared to execute James Barber, the prison was quieter than usual. Not peaceful, just heavy. The kind of silence that settles over a place when everyone already knows how the story ends. Inside the walls of Williams C. Holman Correctional Facility, guards moved through narrow hallways under cold fluorescent lights. Metal doors opened and closed with dull mechanical echoes. Papers were signed. Radios crackled softly. Procedures were repeated exactly the way they had been rehearsed countless times before. And at the center of all of it sat a man who had spent more than 2 decades waiting for this exact night to arrive. 22 years. Think about that for a second. 22 Christmas mornings. 22 birthdays. 22 summers behind concrete walls. 22 years of appeals, delays, court documents, failed hopes, and the slow erosion of time. For most people, 22 years is enough to build an entire life. For James Barber, it was time spent waiting to die. But on this night, the waiting was over. The state of Alabama was preparing to carry out his execution for the 1991 murder of 75-year-old Dorothy Epps, an elderly woman killed during a robbery that shocked a quiet community decades earlier. Outside the prison gates, reporters gathered beneath the dark Alabama sky. Camera crews adjusted tripods. Protesters stood holding signs on opposite sides of the road. Some believed justice was finally arriving. Others believed another human life was about to be taken in the name of the law. And somewhere in between those arguments was a single question that always follows executions in America. What happens to a person after spending decades knowing the exact way they will die? Because death row is different from prison. Prison takes away freedom. Death row takes away the future itself. Every inmate there lives beneath an invisible countdown clock. Sometimes executions are delayed. Sometimes appeals buy more time. Sometimes governors intervene. Sometimes courts step in at the last second. But eventually, for many inmates, the clock reaches zero. That night, James Barber knew his hat. Hours before the execution, prison officials allowed him a final meal. It is one of the strangest traditions in the American justice system. A final meal. One last choice before the state takes everything else away. Some inmates request extravagant feasts. Some ask for childhood comfort food. Some refuse to eat entirely. James Barber's request was simple. A steak, French fries, a salad, and cheesecake for dessert. Nothing theatrical, nothing symbolic. Just an ordinary meal eaten on an extraordinary night. Witnesses later described him as calm. Not cheerful, not emotional, just quiet. As midnight approached, attorneys continued making desperate attempts to stop the execution. Last-minute filings moved through the courts, hoping for a stay that never came. This, too, has become part of the ritual. The final hours are often a race against time. Phones ring. Judges review emergency motions. Families wait for updates. Victims' relatives sit in silence, wondering whether closure is actually real or just another word people use when they want pain to end. But the courts denied the requests. The execution would move forward. For the family of Dorothy Epps, the moment carried decades of grief. Back in 1991, Epps had been known as a kind, elderly woman living alone in Harvest, Alabama. She trusted people easily. Neighbors describe her as gentle and deeply religious. The kind of woman who represented safety and routine in a small southern town. Then one night, violence entered her home, and nothing was ever the same again. According to prosecutors, James Barber entered her house intending to rob her. But the robbery escalated into murder. Dorothy Epps was beaten so brutally that the case horrified investigators. The details were difficult even for seasoned officers to discuss. The murder scene stayed with many of them for years. And from that moment forward, 2 lives became permanently connected. One ended inside a small Alabama home. The other ended slowly over decades on death row. As execution time drew closer, prison staff escorted Barber through the final procedures. Every step had rules. Every movement had protocol. Every second followed a schedule designed long before he arrived there. That is another unsettling thing about executions. The system transforms death into administration. Forms, timetables, witness lists, medical checks, official statements. Everything becomes procedural, even the final words. And eventually, James Barber was asked the same question every condemned inmate hears before the execution begins. Did he have anything he wanted to say? The room waited. Victim witnesses watched closely. Officials stood still. Reporters prepared to write down every word. Because final words carry strange weight in America. Some inmates apologize. Some curse the system. Some quote scripture. Some say nothing at all. After decades of waiting, human beings are suddenly reduced to a final sentence that the world will remember forever. James Barber looked toward the witnesses, and then he spoke. Long before James Barber became another name attached to America's death penalty system, he was just a man drifting through a life that had already started falling apart. People who knew Barber in his younger years described someone angry, unstable, and constantly moving between bad decisions. He struggled with alcohol. He struggled with direction. And over time, small mistakes slowly evolved into a pattern of crime. Not the kind of criminal mastermind people imagine in movies. Something more common. A man who kept choosing the fastest path toward money, regardless of who got hurt along the way. By the early 1990s, Barber was already carrying years of personal failure behind him. Arrests, violence, instability, broken relationships, temporary jobs. The kind of life where every bad choice makes the next one easier. And then came the night that would define everything forever. It was in May of 1991 when 75-year-old Dorothy Epps spent what she believed would be another ordinary evening in her home in Harvest, Alabama. She had no idea she was living the final hours of her life. Neighbors later described the area as quiet and close-knit. People knew each other there. Elderly residents often felt safe enough to leave doors unlocked. It was the kind of place where routines rarely changed. Dorothy Epps represented that world perfectly. She was elderly, religious, soft-spoken, trusted by her community. Friends remembered her as warm and welcoming. The type of woman who treated strangers politely and believed kindness mattered. Even at 75 years old, she still carried herself with independence. That trust would ultimately become fatal. According to prosecutors, James Barber arrived at her home intending to rob her. Investigators later believed he was desperate for money and assumed the elderly woman would be vulnerable. But robberies are unpredictable. Fear changes people. Panic escalates situations. Violence grows fast. Some crimes happen in seconds and still destroy generations afterward. Inside the house, something turned horribly wrong. Authorities said Barber attacked Dorothy Epps with extreme brutality. She was beaten repeatedly inside her own home. The assault was so violent that investigators later described the crime scene as deeply disturbing even by homicide standards. The attack shocked the community because of how personal it felt. This was not a distant gang shooting, not organized crime, not some anonymous tragedy in a large city. An elderly woman had been murdered inside the place where she should have been safest, her own home. For small towns, crimes like that change everything. Afterward, neighbors locked doors that had stayed open for years. People stopped feeling safe at night. Suspicion replaced familiarity. Fear spreads quickly after murders like this because people realize something uncomfortable. Evil does not always arrive with warning signs. Sometimes it simply knocks on the front door. When police began investigating the murder, attention quickly turned toward Barber. Evidence and witness information eventually connected him to the crime. Prosecutors later argued the case showed clear intent to rob Dorothy Epps before the killing occurred. But even after the arrest, the emotional damage continued spreading outward. The Epps family now had to bury someone they loved, while also learning horrifying details about her final moments. And that is one of the darkest parts of homicide cases involving elderly victims. Families cannot stop imagining the fear. A younger victim might fight back physically, might run, might escape, but an elderly woman in her 70s? Most people understand immediately how powerless she must have felt. That image haunted the case for years. Meanwhile, James Barber entered the machinery of the American justice system. At first, he was simply another murder suspect awaiting trial. But capital murder cases are different from ordinary criminal proceedings, because from the very beginning, there are really two separate questions being asked. Did the defendant commit the crime? And if so, does the state have the right to kill him for it? That second question would follow James Barber for more than 2 decades. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors prepared to present the murder as especially cruel and violent. The brutality of Dorothy Epps' death became central to their argument for the death penalty. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, began building another narrative. They argued Barber's life had been shaped by dysfunction, addiction, and personal instability. Like many capital defense teams, they attempted to show the jury that the man sitting in court was more complicated than the worst thing he had ever done. But death penalty trials rarely feel balanced emotionally, especially when photographs from the crime scene enter the courtroom, especially when elderly victims are involved, especially when grieving family members testify. Because once jurors hear how a vulnerable woman died alone inside her home, emotions inevitably begin shaping the outcome. And deep down, everyone in that courtroom already understood the stakes. If convicted, James Barber would not simply disappear in a prison. The state of Alabama would eventually attempt to execute him. The only uncertainty was how long it would take. And neither side realized yet that the case would continue dragging through courts and appeals for more than 20 years before finally ending inside an execution chamber. When the trial of James Barber finally began, the courtroom already carried the emotional weight of the crime before a single witness even testified. Because some murder cases enter court with one undeniable reality. The victim appears defenseless in the eyes of the jury. And 75-year-old Dorothy Epps was exactly that. An elderly woman, living alone, killed inside her own home. For prosecutors in Alabama, the strategy was straightforward. They wanted jurors to see the murder not only as robbery, but as an act of extreme violence against someone completely vulnerable. Every detail mattered. The crime scene photographs, medical testimony, descriptions of Dorothy Epps' injuries, the condition of the house after the attack. Prosecutors carefully reconstructed the final moments of her life piece by piece. They argued Barber entered the home for money, but once violence began, the situation escalated into something far more horrifying. The jury listened as investigators described what they found inside the house. Furniture disturbed, signs of struggle, blood evidence, and above all, the sheer brutality of the beating. In death penalty trials, prosecutors are not just trying to prove guilt. They're also trying to prove severity. Because under American law, not every murder automatically leads to execution. The state must convince jurors that the crime reaches a level deserving the harshest punishment possible. The murder of Dorothy Epps gave prosecutors powerful emotional ground to stand on. Meanwhile, the defense faced a nearly impossible challenge. Defense attorneys did not have the luxury of denying the emotional impact of the crime. Instead, they attempted to humanize Barber himself. They presented him as a damaged man shaped by addiction, instability, and poor decisions accumulated over years. Like many defense teams in capital cases, they hoped at least one juror would hesitate before supporting execution. Because in death penalty trials, one hesitant juror can mean the difference between life and death. The defense tried to shift attention toward Barber's background, his struggles, his mental state, his history of substance abuse. But the prosecution kept bringing the focus back to Dorothy Epps. Back to her age, back to her vulnerability, back to the violence. And emotionally, that is difficult to overcome. Jurors are human beings before they are legal decision makers. When they hear about an elderly woman beaten to death in her own home, logic and emotion begin blending together. As the trial continued, Barber himself sat listening while strangers debated whether he deserved to live. That reality alone feels almost surreal. 12 people you have never met suddenly gain enormous power over the rest of your existence. And eventually, after hearing the evidence, the jury reached its conclusion. James Barber was found guilty of capital murder. But the most important phase was still ahead. Sentencing. That is where death penalty trials become psychologically different from ordinary murder cases. Because after guilt is established, the courtroom shifts into something darker. Now the question becomes simple. Should the defendant die? Prosecutors argued the brutality of Dorothy Epps' murder justified execution. They described the crime as cruel, senseless, and deserving of the maximum punishment allowed under Alabama law. The defense pleaded for life imprisonment instead. Not freedom, not acquittal, just life. A chance for Barber to spend the remainder of his years inside prison rather than an execution chamber. But when the sentencing recommendation came, the outcome was devastating for the defense. The jury supported death. And with that decision, James Barber officially entered death row. At that moment, another invisible transformation occurred. He was no longer simply a prisoner. He became a condemned man, a person the government intended to kill someday. Still, even then, nobody knew that someday would take more than 20 years to arrive, because death row in America often moves at an almost unreal pace. Appeals stretch across decades. New attorneys enter cases. Courts review old evidence. Execution dates appear, disappear, then return again. For victims' families, it can feel endless. For inmates, it becomes a strange, suspended existence where life technically continues, but the future never truly moves forward. And year after year, James Barber remained inside that world, waiting. After the trial ended, James Barber entered a world most people will never truly understand. Death row, not regular prison, not temporary confinement. A place built around waiting for execution. Inside Alabama's prison system, death row inmates live under routines that barely change from year to year. Concrete walls, steel doors, countless hours alone with thoughts that never fully disappear. And for Barber, the years began stacking up slowly. At first, there were still active appeals, still legal hope, still the possibility that a court somewhere might reverse the sentence or grant a new trial. That hope is what keeps many death row inmates mentally alive during the early years. Because as long as appeals continue, death still feels distant. But time changes everything. Months become years. Years become decades. Attorneys come and go. Judges retire. Witnesses age. Victims' families grow older carrying grief that never fully leaves. And meanwhile, the inmate remains trapped in the exact same place, waiting. The strange thing about death row is how ordinary life can begin feeling inside an extraordinary situation. Inmates wake up, eat meals, exercise in isolated yards, read books, watch television, write letters, speak to guards, grow older, even while knowing the state plans to kill them eventually. That contradiction slowly reshapes people psychologically. Some inmates become deeply religious. Some collapse emotionally. Some grow numb. Some convince themselves execution will never actually happen. Others spend years studying law books, trying to save themselves through appeals. James Barber lived through all of it. Over more than 2 decades, his case moved repeatedly through the courts as attorneys challenged aspects of the conviction and sentence. Appeals are automatic in death penalty cases because the punishment is irreversible. Once an execution happens, there is no correction possible. No second chance. That is why death penalty litigation in America often lasts decades. Defense attorneys argued constitutional issues, reviewed trial procedures, examined evidence, filed motions seeking relief. But one by one, the appeals failed, and eventually, the reality became unavoidable. The execution was no longer theoretical. It was approaching. Outside prison walls, America itself was changing during those 22 years. Presidents came and went. Technology transformed daily life. Children grew into adults. Entire cultural eras passed. But inside death row, time moved differently. Many inmates describe it as feeling frozen, like the outside world continues evolving while they remain trapped in the same unfinished moment forever. Meanwhile, the family of Dorothy Epps carried their own version of waiting, because homicide cases never truly end for victims' relatives. Executions are often described publicly as closure, but many families later admit the reality is more complicated. Nothing restores the person they lost. Nothing erases the violence. Nothing gives back the years. Sometimes executions simply reopen old wounds that never healed properly. And as Alabama prepared to move forward with Barber's execution, another controversy quietly emerged around the method itself. Lethal injection. For years, states across America had promoted lethal injection as a humane alternative to older execution methods like the electric chair or gas chamber. But by the time Barber's execution date approached, public confidence in lethal injection had started collapsing. Multiple executions around the country had gone wrong. Some inmates appeared to suffer visibly. Others took unusually long to die. There were botched fore insertions, medical controversies, legal challenges. Even Alabama itself had faced criticism after previous execution problems raised questions about whether the state could carry out executions properly. That debate became part of Barber's final chapter too. His attorneys argued the risks surrounding Alabama's execution procedures created serious constitutional concerns. They pushed courts to intervene before the execution could proceed. But once again, the appeals failed. The date remained set. And suddenly, after 22 years of waiting, the countdown became terrifyingly real. Because death row changes psychologically when inmates finally receive an execution date. Before that moment, death exists abstractly. Afterward, every hour suddenly matters. Every meal, every conversation, every sunrise, everything starts feeling numbered. And for James Barber, the final days had officially begun. By the time James Barber entered his final 24 hours alive, nearly every possible legal option had already failed. The appeals were exhausted. The emergency motions had been denied. And inside Williams C. Holman Correctional Facility, prison staff quietly began preparing for another execution night. For death row inmates, the final day follows an unsettling rhythm. Everything suddenly becomes official. Guards monitor movements more closely. Attorneys make final phone calls. Family members wait for updates that could arrive too late. Religious advisors enter and leave cells. Prison officials review protocols repeatedly. And somewhere in the middle of all that procedure sits the condemned inmate, fully aware that every normal human experience is happening for the last time. The last breakfast, the last shower, the last walk down a prison hallway. Even the smallest moments begin carrying unbearable weight. Reports later describe Barber as calm during much of the day. He met with spiritual advisors and spent time speaking with people close to him. Like many inmates facing execution, he appeared quieter as the hours disappeared. Not dramatic, not emotional in the way movies often portray, just exhausted. Because after 22 years on death row, fear changes shape. It becomes less explosive and more permanent. A constant pressure sitting in the background of every thought. As evening approached, Barber received his final meal. Steak, French fries, salad, cheesecake, simple food. But in America, final meals carry symbolic power far beyond the meal itself. The tradition forces society to confront something uncomfortable. Even moments before execution, the condemned are still treated as human beings with personal choices. For critics of the death penalty, the ritual feels surreal and disturbing. For supporters, it represents dignity before justice is carried out. Either way, the image stays haunting. A man eating cheesecake while the state prepares chemicals that will stop his hard hours later. Outside the prison, media crews gathered beneath the Alabama night sky. Protesters arrived carrying signs against capital punishment. Supporters of the execution stood nearby, believing justice for Dorothy Epps was finally about to be completed. The atmosphere around executions in America often feels divided like that. Two completely different understandings of morality standing on opposite sides of the same prison gate. Inside, Barber's attorneys continued filing desperate last-minute motions. They argued Alabama's execution procedures remained deeply problematic after previous controversial executions in the state. One of the biggest concerns involved the insertion of intravenous lines required for lethal injection. In earlier executions, Alabama had faced accusations of prolonged procedures and failed attempts to properly prepare inmates for execution. Critics argued the system risked unnecessary suffering. Those fears intensified as Barber's execution time approached. Eventually, guards arrived at his cell. This is often described as one of the most psychologically devastating moments in the entire process. Because until guards physically arrive, some tiny part of the condemned person still imagines the phone could ring, that a judge could intervene, that a stay could appear, that somehow death might still be postponed. But once the escort team arrives, reality becomes unavoidable. The process has begun. Barber was escorted from his cell through prison hallways he had walked for decades. Witnesses later described the atmosphere as controlled and quiet, almost clinical. That is another disturbing aspect of executions. The state tries to remove chaos from death entirely. Everything becomes orderly, measured, procedural, even killing. When Barber entered the execution chamber, witnesses took their places behind glass. Officials checked restraints. Medical personnel prepared equipment. And then another problem emerged. According to later reports, prison staff struggled for an extended period attempting to establish the intravenous lines necessary for the lethal injection. Time passed. Witnesses waited. The procedure became increasingly tense. For critics of capital punishment, moments like these represent one of the strongest arguments against the death penalty itself. Because once executions begin resembling medical experiments or prolonged procedures, the image of a humane death starts collapsing quickly. But eventually, the execution moved forward, and before the drugs entered his body, James Barber was given one final opportunity to speak. The room fell silent, because everyone understood these would be the last words he would ever say alive. Inside the execution chamber at William C. Holman Correctional Facility, the atmosphere had become painfully still. Witnesses stood behind thick glass. Officials watched closely. Reporters prepared notebooks. Family members of Dorothy Epps waited only a few feet away from the man convicted of killing her more than 20 years earlier. And at the center of the room, strapped to a gurney beneath bright lights, was James Barber. The execution process had already become tense after prison staff reportedly struggled to insert the intravenous lines necessary for the lethal injection. Time dragged on as personnel attempted to complete the procedure properly. Moments like that make executions feel less like justice and more like something strangely mechanical. Not quick, not clean, just human beings trying to control death with procedure manuals and chemicals. Eventually, officials confirmed the execution would continue. Then came the final question. Did he have any last words? It is one of the oldest rituals in capital punishment. A final opportunity to speak before the state and to life permanently. Some inmates apologize. Some pray. Some express anger. Some remain silent because words no longer feel meaningful. James Barber looked toward the witnesses and spoke calmly. I love all of you. Then he added another sentence directed toward the victim's family and those present in the chamber. I apologize. The words were brief. No dramatic speech. No political statement. No emotional outburst. Just a final apology delivered after more than 2 decades waiting for death. But final words during executions always raise difficult questions. Can an apology after 22 years still matter? Can remorse change anything once a life has already been taken? Can victims' families ever truly hear those words without remembering the violence first? For some people, the answer is no. To many supporters of the death penalty, Barber's execution represented justice finally reaching its conclusion. They believe the murder of Dorothy Epps deserved the harshest punishment available under the law. An elderly woman had been beaten to death inside her own home. Nothing could undo that. Nothing could erase the fear she experienced during her final moments. And for some observers, execution becomes society's ultimate declaration that certain crimes permanently cross the line of forgiveness. But opponents of capital punishment viewed the scene differently. They saw a man who had already spent 22 years imprisoned, a man growing old inside a concrete cell, a man now strapped to a table while the government prepared to stop his heart deliberately. To them, the execution itself represented another form of violence. That divide has existed in America for generations, and execution chambers force both sides to confront uncomfortable truths at the same time. Moments after Barber finished speaking, the lethal injection process began. The drugs entered his body through the 4 lines prison staff had spent so long trying to establish. Witnesses observed quietly as his breathing gradually slowed. Executions by lethal injection are designed to appear peaceful from the outside. No firing squad, no visible physical trauma, no electric chair smoke, just a body slowly becoming still. But critics argue that appearance can be misleading. Medical experts and legal observers have repeatedly questioned whether inmates truly experience a painless death during lethal injection procedures. Because unlike surgery, executions are not performed to heal the body. They are performed to shut it down completely. As the drugs continued flowing, Barber's movements reportedly became minimal. Witnesses watched silently through the glass barrier separating the living from the dying. And then, after more than 20 years on death row, the waiting finally ended. James Barber was pronounced dead. Another execution completed. Another case closed officially by the state. But executions rarely end emotionally when they end legally. Because after the witnesses leave and the prison lights dim, the larger questions remain behind. Did justice happen inside that chamber? Or did violence simply answer violence one final time? That debate has followed the American death penalty system for decades, and it continues long after the condemned person takes their final breath. When the execution of James Barber officially ended, the witnesses slowly began leaving the chamber at William C. Holman Correctional Facility. The reporters walked outside first, then prison officials, then attorneys, then the relatives connected to a murder that had destroyed lives more than 3 decades earlier. And almost immediately, the outside world moved on. News headlines appeared online within minutes. Alabama executes James Barber. Death row inmate put to death after 22 years. Final words before lethal injection. Another execution became another news cycle. But for the people emotionally tied to the case, nothing was that simple. Because executions do not rewind time. They do not bring victims back. They do not erase trauma. They do not restore the years stolen by violence. At best, they create an ending. And even that ending often feels emotionally incomplete. For the family of Dorothy Epps, the execution likely reopened memories they had spent decades trying to survive. Every appeal, every court hearing, every new execution date forced them to revisit the murder again and again. That is one of the hidden realities of death penalty cases. The legal process meant to deliver justice can also prolong grief for decades. Some families eventually support execution because they believe it honors the victim. Others grow emotionally exhausted by the endless cycle of appeals and media attention. And some leave the process feeling emptier than before. Because closure is not a guaranteed outcome. It is just a word people use hoping pain can eventually settle somewhere manageable. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the national debate surrounding capital punishment continued growing louder, especially in states like Alabama, where controversial executions had already raised serious concerns about lethal injection procedures. Critics pointed directly at the problems during Barber's execution itself, particularly the reported difficulties establishing for access before the drugs were administered. To opponents of the death penalty, scenes like that expose something deeper. The modern execution system constantly promises precision and humanity, yet repeatedly struggles to deliver either one consistently. And that contradiction matters, because if the state claims executions are controlled, humane, and medically sound, then every visible complication weakens public confidence further. Supporters of capital punishment responded differently. They argued the focus should remain on the victim rather than the condemned inmate. From their perspective, discussions about Barber's discomfort during execution ignored the far greater suffering experienced by Dorothy Epps during the murder itself. That emotional divide is why America remains deeply split over the death penalty even today. One side views execution as justice. The other views it as legalized killing. And cases like James Barber's rarely change anyone's position completely. Instead, they force people to confront the uncomfortable consequences of whichever belief they already hold. Because there are no clean endings in stories like this. An elderly woman died violently inside her home. A man spent 22 years waiting in a concrete cell before the state executed him. Neither reality cancels out the other. And maybe that is the darkest truth surrounding death row in America. Every execution creates two separate tragedies existing side by side. The original crime, and the slow ritual that follows afterward. In the end, James Barber's final words were simple. "I love all of you. I apologize." Some people heard remorse in those sentences. Others heard nothing meaningful at all. But once the execution chamber doors closed that night, the arguments, emotions, and moral questions surrounding the case did not disappear. They never do, because the death penalty is not just about punishment. It forces society to answer a far more disturbing question. What does justice actually look like when a human life has already been destroyed? And after all these years, America still has not agreed on the answer.